In a few minutes, but we've still got people gradually filtering in. So can I ask you all to move along the rows so there's no spaces in them, so that those arriving late can just freely come in without disturbing you if they arrive a bit later. Thank
Hello, can I sing with you? Thank you.
Good evening to you all, and welcome to to the evening conference on natural hazards, conflicts, and disasters in the Himalaya, and where now the future. So thank you all for coming. This is part of the UCL Humanitarian Institute series built around the UN Sustainable Development Goals, brought to you, produced by the UCL Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. I just want to particularly welcome all the school students who have arrived this evening. You're most welcome. And some of you I know might be interested in our new BSc program, Global Humanitarian Studies, which will be starting to recruit later this year for its launch. First students will be admitted in September 2021. And today, if you stay to the reception after, we have a couple of our master's students. There's a Lanley, just like to stand up, Lanley. And Emma Matthews. And they'll be around, so if you want to ask them what it's like being a student at UCL, you can do that in the reception. I want to thank our speakers. So we have 4 speakers this evening. There's Dr. Jessica Field from Brunel University, Professor Sultan Bart from the University of Kashmir, Dr. Akhtar Alam, who is at the UCL Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction on leave from the University of Kashmir, and Dr. Poonam Yadav, who's also from the UCL Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. I have to apologise that Professor Ahmed from the University of Kashmir has not been able to make it. His visa was turned down twice by the Home Office on quite spurious grounds, and on the second occasion there's no possibility of appeal. So he sends his best wishes, and we thank you actually for the efforts he made to get him involved 2 visits to New Delhi. Well, we've got a good program lined up. Means that I'm going to actually chair the meeting. That was going to be Akhtar Alam is going to actually chair the meeting, but he will now be speaking instead of Professor. So I don't want to say too much more, then I'll try and keep speakers to time, and then half an hour from the end we should wrap up the speeches, and then there'll be a chance to have discussions and have a chance for you to have your input, and we'll sort of do that in the sort of question time format, where we just go around collecting a few questions and bring it to the panel to comment on. So I think then with that, I will introduce then the first speaker, Dr. Jessica Field, is a lecturer in global challenges at Brunel University. She is a member of the UNHCR Indian Academicians Working Group in New Delhi, where she was until released recently an associate professor at O.P. Jindal Global University. She will introduce disasters in the Himalayas in the historical and social context. So, Jessica, please.
Thank you, Peter, very much for the introduction and for the invitation to be here. It's great to see such a full room, and hopefully it won't get too hot and uncomfortable over the course of the evening. So the title of my talk today is Disaster Governance in the Indian Himalayan region, and I've been working on a variety of different projects relating to the governance of relief and humanitarianism in India over the last few years, and I look at both disaster governance and also refugee protection and assistance in this context. Now, one of those projects I've been working on that this talk is based on was led by Peter and other colleagues at ILDR here at UCL, looking at building and understanding disaster resilience in the Himalayan context. Separate to that, I've also been involved. I was based out in India for 3 years up until September last year. So I spent the last 2 years in the archives, the National Archives of India, looking at disaster management histories. So I know there are a lot of sixth form students here thinking about doing humanitarian studies. If anyone has a history interest or background, I'm really keen to chat afterwards, because this is a real growth area of research. So combining these two pieces of work, the work looking at resilience in the Indian Himalayan region and my work in the archives, I've started to chart some patterns in disaster governance, both at the central level from the Indian government, the central state, but also at the periphery areas in the Indian Himalayan region. And it's those patterns I want to talk about today. But before going into details, it's worth defining a few key concepts and looking at where exactly we're talking about, if you're not all familiar with where this is. You can see this beautiful picture, but need to place it geographically. So firstly, term disaster governance, what does it mean? Is it the same as disaster management? Is it the same as humanitarianism? In short, no. It's quite a new concept in the scholarship, and it's much more inclusive. So it considers how disaster risk reduction and relief intersect with other areas of governance, areas that you'll be very familiar with, I'm sure. So risk and environmental governance, state-society relations, economic organisation and security, as well as those relief practices and histories. Now, what I'm interested in focusing on just in this presentation, because it's short, are three areas of disaster governance in the Indian Himalayan region. So relief practices and histories, state-society relations, and security. I want to explore how they all intersect and exacerbate community vulnerability to disasters in those areas. Perhaps there'll be the chance in the Q&A to talk about the other areas of governance too. Where exactly is Ladakh? What is the area that I'm talking about? Well, you can see the Himalayan mountain range stretching across a number of different countries in this bottom right picture here. So Bhutan, China, Nepal, Pakistan, and India. And the region that I'm particularly interested in, that I've been looking at, is the northernmost part of India in what used to be Jammu and Kashmir state, but was reorganised last year into two union territories, very controversially. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But you can see Ladakh is this yellow area that borders both China and Pakistan, both of whom are enemy countries to India. So it's a highly sensitive conflict border zone. So this is where I've been doing some research. It's quite distinct. It doesn't look like the rest of mainland India in the sense that it's very Tibetan influenced, backing up to China, has a long history on the Silk Road and trade connections throughout the area. And it's predominantly a Buddhist area rather than Hindu, which is the majority of India. What hazards is Ladakh exposed to? Well, a high variety. It's up in the mountain areas. It has a lot of glaciers, so it's very prone to flooding, both from cloudbursts and also the breaking of dams that are holding in glacial lakes. There's also a high risk of avalanches and landslides. In winter, there's incredibly heavy snowfall, and actually the region is pretty much inaccessible by road during the winter period. And it's also in a seismic zone 5, which is the highest level of kind of earthquake risk. So it's very, very hazard exposed and sensitive climatic region. So the patterns of disaster governance that I've identified in these areas, you can see the three parts that I'm interested in, are that broadly what you see here is a hazard-centered and reactive approach to disasters, not one that seeks to prevent them from happening, but one that seeks to give relief once they've already happened. In terms of state-society relations, they're very top-down. You're seeing the centralisation of relief and disaster materials driven from the government in Delhi, which is thousands of miles away. So centralisation of resources and authority. And of course, there's a significant security component there. It's a conflict border zone, a very sensitive border zone, and the military are permanently stationed in this region. So there's a heavy reliance on the military as key humanitarian actors. Now, these norms, these patterns that I've identified are increasing community vulnerability to hazards because there is virtually no investment in this area in preparedness for disasters, in risk reduction. And there's also limited political and civil space for organisations to grow that might tackle risk reduction and preparedness. So limited political and civil space for NGOs, for example, to do this kind of work. So how have we got to this situation and why is it unlikely to change? That's what I'm focusing on over the remaining 15 minutes. I want to put it in historical context. So I'm going to start with a bit of a brief overview of India's wider humanitarian history. How have those norms of governing relief and aid developed since independence in 1947? And I want to show how India's disaster governance approach has come to be kind of top-down and bound with security concerns. So I believe or I argue that key norm-shaping decades for disaster governance for the Indian government were both pre- and post-independence in 1947, so from the 1930s to the 1960s. Until 1947, it was a British colony, and the British government were therefore responsible for relief. They approached this in a very kind of Victorian charity model, so they viewed humanitarian relief as a gift rather than a duty, something they didn't have to offer. This was a very predominant norm even in Britain during the period. But this left space for other actors to fill and to kind of contest their legitimacy in this space. It was obviously not a particularly popular way of delivering relief, wasn't received very well, and these kind of failures and weaknesses came to a head with a series of disasters over the 1930s. So first, the 1934 earthquake in Bihar, followed by a number of floods in 1935, and then secondly, an earthquake in Quetta, which is now Pakistan, in 1935. So the British government was obviously responsible to respond to these disasters, and they did so quite ineffectively. So in Bihar, you saw Indian nationalist forces who were like pushing for independence arrive to the area, and they set up competing relief funds with the British government and were highlighting the failures of the British government in responding to and protecting people and saving human life in this context. And then when an earthquake hit Quetta in 1935, the government was so conscious of this level of competition that they actually sealed it to outside help. They forbid volunteers from entering the area, and this again was heavily criticised. And Indian national forces capitalised on these weaknesses and used kind of their strength in humanitarian relief as part of their wider movement for independence. So what we're seeing in this area was disasters increasingly becoming overt sites of contest over political authority and legitimacy. Then in 1947, the Indian National Congress became the government of India. India gained independence, and they were faced with an immediate humanitarian challenge, which was partition. As India and Pakistan gained their independence, you saw the mass, violent and forced migration of over 10 million people that went on for many years, and the Indian government were faced with responding to it. They responded to it with the mass mobilization of military resources. They created a military evacuation organization, deployed soldiers to help with the movement of people, the distribution of relief goods, and the running of relief camps. And this was beginning to cement a preference for technocratic experience, logistical experience, and officer expertise in a soldier background in relief operations there forward. As well as the kind of refugee migration crisis of partition, you also saw a disaster in the form of an earthquake in Assam in 1950 that was so strong that it actually reshaped the topography of the region. The Indian government, of course, were again responsible for responding to this, but when they arrived in the area to distribute relief goods and offer humanitarian assistance, they realised that there were a number of other humanitarian actors already on the ground doing so, local first responders, but also opposing political forces who were criticising the Indian National Congress for not reacting quickly. So what you can see in these early years of governance were certain patterns emerging. Humanitarian crises being understood by the central authority as a test of authority, as a test of legitimacy. And you could also see command and control structures, so kind of military approaches being cemented, being understood as the best means to both maintain order but also effectively distribute aid materials. Then in 1958, so you've got, kind of the politics of humanitarian aid in the history up to this point, plus the use of military relief sources just because they're very effective. Then you saw in the late 1950s, early 1960s, a cementing of relief with the question of security. So I say a massive flood hit Delhi. It wasn't significant in the context of other floods in Indian history. There was very limited loss of life. But it was a politically embarrassing flood because it devastated the city infrastructurally, and it was right on the doorstep of the capital. So the government, they had disaster management plans in place, and they said, what has gone on here? It's been an epic failure. But beyond that, it highlighted to them that there was a big security risk in how ill-equipped their forces were to respond to any type of emergency, whether disaster or military. And at this point in Indian history, the state was moving closer toward antagonistic relations with both China and Pakistan, would actually end up at war with China in 1962. So as a result of this, this failure to respond in the floods, the Home Ministry drew up a list. Okay, we need to look at areas that are vulnerable to both natural hazards, but also at a security risk. And you can see the photo in the background. That's the government document that provides the list of those cities. And what the government did after this moment was they reorganised their civil defence and their civil defence bodies that were previously focused on disaster response to focus on security first and then relief afterwards. So you've got the kind of triumvirate there of the politics of humanitarianism, military as an effective resource, and then a shift to security. So how does this relate to Ladakh specifically? Obviously that was a broader Indian history, but I'm looking at a particular context. Well, in terms of the historical record of hazards and responses in Ladakh, there's very limited information on it. Because it's been such a sensitive border zone, it was actually closed off to any outsiders between 1949 and 1974. So there's very limited kind of written record of disasters during the period. Significant disasters that have happened since 1947 were floods in 78, which severely affected the entirety of the country, and also a cloudburst in 2010, which is much more recent. Over 200 people died in that. Now, the state government was overwhelmed in both cases, and the army were again deployed. They were the primary resource, and they were very much relief-focused. A big issue in this area, because it's a sensitive border conflict zone with a number of conflicts kind of affecting it, as well as communal tensions within the area. You're seeing that many actors, so there's a prohibition of many different types of actors from operating in the zone. So it's very difficult for NGOs to form and operate. They need the permission of the government, which is very hard to get. Many national level NGOs, such as Save the Children India and so on, found it incredibly difficult to respond to the 2010 floods because the government was at first unwilling to give them access. But there are also key kind of sensitive areas that researchers, scientists and NGOs aren't even given permission to go into because they're under the control of the military. So it's a very tight controlled area. And this means that there continues to be this over-reliance on chains of command, on military assets and on soldiers as primary humanitarian agents. And actually, I mean, you know, framing this kind of security context, it's not even necessarily perceived as a negative one in the context. Across much of Ladakh, the army is seen as a protective force. You know, they recognise also China and Pakistan as belligerent forces on their border, and they're very pleased to have their army there, and they're economically dependent on a lot of army business. So this is viewed as a positive relationship, but it's cementing one that's very reactive in terms of disasters and very relief-orientated rather than preventative. So where are we in terms of the present day? Well, as part of the project that I mentioned at the beginning that was led by IRDR at UCL, we were engaging with the district authorities in Ladakh on updating their disaster management plan after the 2010 floods. So this was a project that has gone on from 2017 until 2019. The local authorities there have recognised that they have limitations in this area, that there's a weak management structure, there's a weak kind of response framework, and that they are very reactive, and they're seeking to change it. So they're looking to update their disaster management plans, but these continue to remain paper schemes in that they are literally just kind of policy documents that aren't translating into any kind of effective action. They are there also as response plans rather than focused on assessing vulnerability and creating preparedness. But at least they were working on something, and this is something that we were contributing to as a wider team at UCL and a number of other institutions. And then the situation changed on the ground in August 2019. So on the 5th of August last year, the Indian government unilaterally revoked the special status that Jammu and Kashmir state has in the constitution, which gives them a lot of kind of governance rights and powers, and essentially demoted and divided them to 2 union territories to be ruled directly by Delhi. So they lost some of their autonomy, split in 2, and ruled by what is currently the BJP government, but whichever government is in power at the time. Now, this wasn't, even though Ladakh wanted union territory status ultimately, for a number of complicated reasons, this wasn't done in consultation and there was no advance warning of it. So whatever disaster management plans Ladakh had up to that point were pretty much rendered redundant on come August the 6th. So you've got a situation now, again, thinking about the politics of humanitarianism, where even the paper schemes that are there won't help in the event, even in terms of relief in the event of a crisis. Related to that kind of reorganization of the state, you've seen communications and mobility restrictions, increasing everyday vulnerability. So in parts of Ladakh and over most of Kashmir Valley, you saw the internet shut down, you saw mobile, like phone lines shut down, schools shut down, and curfews that of course exacerbate vulnerability. If a disaster was to hit, how do people communicate, get any early warning, and know where to evacuate? As related to the kind of, the political fallout of this, there's been a significant erosion of trust between the local community and the government. As I say, even in Ladakh, where this was a desired outcome, there was no consultations, there's no ownership of the process at this point. And what you have now are Ladakh and its neighbouring districts going on different paths. So you can see a kind of complex intersection of factors that are affecting disaster governance and increasing local vulnerability. So to kind of bring all of that together, because it's a lot to take in, looking at the national context as well as the local context, disaster governance is a really useful concept and tool for trying to understand why communities are vulnerable and what might be effective or less effective in a moment of crisis and a relief scenario. And what you can see happening in Ladakh are these intersecting layers of governance that are affecting relief practices. So of course you've got cumulative everyday disasters, whether that's small-scale avalanches and landslides or significant disaster shocks like the floods. You've got a history of power tussles, both at the national level and the local level, as sites of disaster are resulting in competing claims for authority and legitimacy. And you're seeing state-society relations being fundamentally shaped by security issues in the Himalayan region, border conflict politics with China and Pakistan. And this is obviously exacerbating vulnerability. Now, this is really important, not just because it's an important narrative to highlight, to understand why vulnerability is occurring, but also because, as we've seen in our engagements with the Ladakh district authorities, quite often when solutions are sought, they are still reactive and they're still technocratic. They're still focused on developing a disaster management plan, a document to help guide responses to crises in the moment. But they're very crises focused, and they don't look at these wider governance issues, this wider politics that is informing and shaping vulnerability. And I think it's without engaging with these underlying governance norms that you're going to see this kind of cycle of hazard-centered, reactive relief kind of perpetuating, both in the Ladakh context and in wider India. So that's a whistle-stop tour of disaster governance, and hopefully this is a picture here on the slide behind of Kargil, which is in Ladakh and just borders is just on the Pakistan border of India, an absolutely beautiful area. So hopefully this has given you a bit of context on disaster vulnerability in that very specific site. Thank you.
Right, so I would now like to invite Professor Sultan Bhatt to speak. Professor Bhatt is a professor of geography in the University of Kashmir, where he's head of the department and also dean of the faculty. He'll be addressing the human drivers of vulnerability and disaster risk in Kashmir. His research interests also include watershed studies and impact of urbanization in mountain regions.
Hello, good evening to everybody. It's really a matter of honor to be here at UCL to share my ideas about the chosen theme. I will be specifically taking the examples from the Kashmir Valley as a case study. Before going to just delve on my presentation, I would like to say that so far as the vulnerability to natural hazards and disasters in the Himalayan belt is concerned, more or less they have the universal character. In the sense that the nature of the geophysical processes which are operating in the region, they are almost same, and the emergent hazards and disasters, they have got almost the same character with a few very insignificant regional variations. Among the disaster profile or the natural hazard profile which we have prevalent in the Himalayas, we have largely I'm talking about the Indian Himalayas, we have the two main natural hazards. One is the flooding problem, because that has got a very huge geographical spread in the whole Indian subcontinent. It's not only very severe in terms of its geographical spread, but in terms of its incidence as well. The second is earthquakes. I will be dealing with the first problem, that is the floods, because the problem is widespread throughout the Indian subcontinent. It is having a larger ramifications. Not only the lives of the people, but so far as the basic economy is concerned, it gets affected almost on annual basis. Now, why focus on Jammu and Kashmir? Because so far as the Indian part of the Himalayas is concerned, it comprises of almost 12 territorial subunits, which we call as the states. Among them, Jammu and Kashmir, it constitutes almost 42% of the geographical area of the Indian Himalayas. The physical processes which are being operating in the region, of late, we have observed from various studies that their magnitude has increased over the period of time. Mainly because of the unplanned massive human interventions which are taking place in this very fragile mountain belt. The main focus so far as the factors that aggravate the problem are concerned, they are mainly in the context of land use and land cover change. Because if we are going to analyze the very economic profile of the people living in the Himalayan belt, they have their only one important resource on which the whole economy is relying, that is the land, from which the agriculture activities are being derived, and the ancillary sectors of the agriculture, like the annual husbandry. So the whole Himalayan belt, so far as population is concerned, they have a heavy reliance on the land resources. That is why that massive changes are being observed so far as the land cover is concerned, in which we have the problems of deforestation. We are experiencing the cropping land use shift. We are experiencing the very important land use from the ecological point of view, that is the wetland loss. And there have been, of course, the considerable expansion in the build-up area in the entire Himalayas, including the Jammu and Kashmir. Now, what are the major triggers so far as this land cover change is concerned? Number one is the population growth and rapid urbanization which is taking place. The rapid urbanization in the Himalayan belt is being boosted by the mass tourism because the entire belt is of scenic beauty and it has tremendous tourism potential. With the result, it has boosted the levels of urbanization in the entire Himalayan belt, particularly in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. But there have been also the fallout so far as this tourism development is concerned. Basically, the very economic profile of the indigenous communities which were living in these remote areas, they have been marginalized in the sense that they have been dispossessed of from their resources, the vital resource, that is the land resource. And then equally another important factor that has contributed to the land cover change as a triggering factor, that is the heavy dependence on firewood, timber and livestock grazing so far as the natural resource endowments in these areas are concerned. Mostly these requirements are met from the forest areas, pasture lands and the grazing lands whose exploitation is being done ruthlessly without any proper scientific management. And of course, by virtue of having the abundant water resources which we are getting from the glacial resources, a huge number of the hydropower projects have been developed across the state, due to which the construction of the dams have taken place, which has ultimately led to the displacement of the huge population settlements. And in many areas, the displacement has proved a very environmental catastrophe in the sense that large areas which were densely forested, they have been cut off. And the area has experienced a huge degradation and deforestation of the forests. Then of course there are the issues of governance. Despite the fact that we have the huge number of the laws to safeguard the environment, like we have the Forest Protection Act, we have the Wildlife Protection Act, and many more acts which ensure the protection of the environment and the various environmental resources of the region. But when it comes to the implementation on the ground, there is a poor implementation of these laws. And because of the several reasons in the sense that these areas have faced social marginalization, they have faced economic marginalization. With the result, there is no regard of laws and rules so far as their implementation is concerned. Now coming to the other issues which trigger these problems of environmental destruction in these areas with regard to the land use land cover change is the population density. Then the population density we are discussing in the context of the only available resource, that is the agriculture resource in the context of that zone area. If we are going to just have a look on this, sorry. So we have got an incidental break. You will excuse me, the audience will excuse me here. So we are back to it. So we are talking in the context of the major boosters so far as this environmental and land degradation in the Himalayas is concerned. In the context of the population density, if we are going to just examine these graphs, so far as the population density is concerned, holiday level is like this, it is almost 430. And J&K state, it is exceeding the national level so far as the density is concerned. And then the net zone area, because there is a lot of, strong correlation between the population density and the net zone area. And in terms of the net zone area, it is very low. Now, we can say that the physiological density in the state is very high. Physiological density, that is, the man-land ratio is very low. So we can imagine there is a lot of pressure on the land resources so far as this very particular sub-territorial unit of Jammu and Kashmir is concerned. They are coming to another important aspect which is being considered as rather a booster so far as the environmental degradation is concerned, that is the poverty. In the Indian context, the national average of the poverty is almost, it is 23 to 24% as the official statistics tells us. And though across these Himalayan states, we can find that except a few states, rather the Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, and the Assam, and then the West Bengal of the Darjeeling district, the poverty ratios are high. But in all other states, major states, the poverty ratios are very low. But here we have to understand the poverty ratios in the context that we are facing the phenomenon of absolute poverty. And there is the difference between the poverty, relative poverty, and the absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is the real disaster so far as the protection of the environment is concerned. Because you are facing the huge pressure on the environmental resources. And unless and until you will get the stabilization so far as the income levels are concerned, you will be having the stabilization in the environmental indicators. So that is why the poverty ratios are to be interpreted in absolute terms, which are putting a heavy stress on the environmental resources of that very particular region. Now coming to the land cover change of the Kashmir Valley, this is the scenario from 1992 to 2017. We have the important categories like the dense forest. Then we have the water bodies. Then we have the built-up area also. All of them have shown a considerable shrinkage over the period of time. Whether those are the dense forests, whether the important water bodies or the agricultural land, the land use categories have shown over the period of time a considerable shrinkage, which is not a good sign from the environmental point of view, especially in that part of the world, because all of these land use categories, they reflect as the protectors of the local ecology and the local environment. So these are some of the scenes of the deforestation which are taking place in the upstream areas. And this deforestation is being used for many purposes. Number one is the expansion in the tourism infrastructure, then expansion in the agricultural activities, like this is one of the famous tourist stores of Pahalgam, and the tourist activity, it is seasonal in character, mostly confined to the summer season. We receive about, on an annual basis, 1.3 million tourists so far as this very particular tourist node is concerned. And the daily average flow of tourists is almost 17,000 against a carrying capacity of 4,500 tourists per day. So we can consider the amount of the pressure on the environmental resources so far as this particular tourist node is concerned, which could be reflected from these photographs. Just see how ruthlessly the forest wealth is being gets destroyed on the basis of the expansion in the hotelier industry. In some areas, the forests are being cut very plainly, and in other areas like this, the chemical spray is being used to just get the forests extinct. So these are some examples where the forest wealth has been destroyed mainly to boost the tourism industry in that very particular area. This is one of the brazen examples that how the human drivers have played a very negative role in inducing the environmental disaster in that very particular Himalayan region. Again, so far as the Kashmir region is concerned, we have a huge reservoir of meadowlands, what is called the huge grazing lands. This was a grazing land, and you can just see from this photograph that there is an intricate interplay of the forces. Like these are the traditional hutments in which the indigenous population used to live there. They were very eco-friendly. They had the capacity to adapt to the local environment and preserve the local environment. But with the expansion of the tourist industry, especially the hotel expansion, which is taking place here and it is encroaching into now the forest areas, and then the unregulated grazing in these meadowlands, they are putting a lot of biotic pressure so far as the environmental resources of the region are concerned. My point is here that the incidence of the disasters, these have been triggered so far as their magnitude is concerned, so far as their incidence is concerned, these have been activated by these different types of the human drivers. Now we're talking about the indigenous communities in these areas. Mostly the tourism developmental model was introduced there to elevate the poverty of the local people. But it has miserably failed. Instead, what we have observed that these communities which were possessing this little bit agricultural land, then the traditional hutments like these, their land have been purchased by the local corporates and they have been dispossessed of their only vital resource, that is the land, and they are experiencing the excessive marginalization so far as their economic resources are concerned. Now, this is the present scenario so far as the expansion of the hotel industry is concerned. These tourist nodes, which some 3 decades before were being considered as the repository of the environmental resources, whether those are the forests, those are the glaciers, or were being considered as the hotspots of the biodiversity. Now, this is the situation now. They have been turned into townships. Huge hoteliering industry has come up in these areas. And with the result, they have created a havoc so far as the upstream environmental scenario is concerned. Again, so far as the rural India is concerned, it is having a heavy dependence on the forest resources in order to meet the domestic energy consumption requirements. Almost we have, this is the position per capita consumption so far as the firewood which is extracted from the forest is concerned. In the Himalayan states, almost all the states are above the national average. This is the Indian situation, national average, but so far as the Himalayan states are concerned, they are above the national average. 77% of the rural households in the Himalayan belt, they are dependent to meet their energy requirements. All of them are being, I mean, say, derived from the forests. So we can just imagine that what could be the extent of the damage which is being done so far as the forest resources are concerned. So these are the pictures which represent the position so far as the dependence of the forests are concerned vis-a-vis the rural Kashmir. And you can just see that this is one of the traditional, I mean to say, this fire pot on which the day-to-day meals and every, I mean to say, meal preparation is being done on the basis of using the firewood which is being extracted from the forests. And then another important dimension is that this firewood is being converted in the charcoal, which has got a huge demand in the urban markets because we have got the very harsh winters. We are having the freezing temperatures, a lot of snowfall is there, and we are using the charcoal which is being, we are getting from the wood, and it is being used in excessive quantities. And this wood, it serves as an additional source of income to the rural families, which gives them an extra reason to just, I mean to say, indulge in the exploitation of the forest wealth so far as these areas are concerned. And this has social dimension as well, in the sense that it is mostly the women folk which are involved in the collection and the extraction of the forest wood. It is almost their daily routine to get themselves involved in the extraction of the forest wood. So that way, it impacts their health, it impacts their education, and other related aspects which are, I mean to say, for their overall health development, overall social development, it gets impacted on account of these factors. Yes, now This is the urban expansion. So far as the Srinagar city is concerned, 100 years urban expansion, that how it has expanded over the period of the time. This is the largest urban center in the Himalayas, and among the first 100 fastest growing cities in the world, 1.5 million population with a density of 4,500 per square kilometer. So this is equivalent to any, I mean, say, leading capital city of the world, so far as the density figures are concerned. We can imagine just how fast urbanization is taking place in the mountainous areas of the Himalayas, which is proving detrimental so far as the resources are concerned, because we have a concentrated model of the urban growth rather the decentralized model of the urban. Now, coming to the position of the wetlands, these are the wetlands, another important, I mean to say, environmental repository, which are playing a very important role. They act as sponges during the, rather acted as a sponge during the times of the floods, but they have been encroached ruthlessly because of the urban expansion, as the figures are showing that what is the position of the wetlands from 1970 to 2015. Almost 60% of the area of the west got extincted, which were being considered as the ecological repositories in order to avoid the incidence of the flooding on a regular basis. We have the paucity of the time. While coming to this, these last slides, maybe having a very quick look over these slides. This is the position of the whole Kashmir Valley. It's a bowl of the Kashmir Valley, which is surrounded by the Himalayan Mountain system. These are the Pir Punjab ranges, and these are the Greater Himalayas. And we have one major drainage line, that is the River Jhelum, which is flowing from this. This is basically south. This is not north. This is flowing from south to north, like this. And one exit from this distillery exit. And all the changes which I have discussed through the slides, they are taking on along these mountain ranges here. And finally, all the physical processes, their magnitude gets accentuated, and with the result, this bowl is facing the problems. And one of the major problems is the problem of flooding. Yes, we have reconstructed the flood frequency profile of the region from 635 AD to 2014 flood. What we have observed that some 3 or 4 decades back, we were facing a flood in 1 decade. Then afterwards, a flood in after 5 years. Now a situation has reached, because of the changes which have taken place in the upstream, which have been discussed, that we are facing a flood almost on an annual basis. That is quite alarming so far as the scenario of the hazards and disasters is concerned. So these are some of the images which have been, I mean to say, which are related to the 2014 flood. This is the pre-flood position, this is the post-flood position, and this valley bound, which I have earlier shown, got inundated in the flood of 2014. With the result, almost 65% of the population have suffered on account of these floods, resulting in a loss of these human lives and the resources as well. So again, the picture of 2014 floods. In a nutshell, what I conclude that there have been the great triggers of the environmental destruction in the upstream areas. They have accentuated the problem so far as the vulnerability is concerned, that the major problem of the increasing incidence of the floods, which is almost being experienced on an annual basis. So with these remarks, I have taken some extra time. You will excuse me for that. So thank you.
So next we have Dr. Poonam Yadav, who is a senior research fellow in the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction and co-director of the Centre for Gender and Disaster. She is also Secretary General of the Britain the Fall Academic Council. So she'll address gender impacts of disaster and conflict on development and social transformation in post-conflict, post-disaster conflict.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. I am going to take you to Nepal, and I'm not going to be talking about natural hazards-related disaster. I'm going to talk to you about conflict. And even so, I am going to be talking about positive impacts of conflict, which may sound a bit weird, but I'll just take you through what I mean by that. Nepal is a tiny country with 28 million population. It's quite diverse in terms of caste and ethnicity. So there are 125 castes and ethnicity in Nepal, and each of them look very different. They have their own culture, own customs, and they also speak various languages. So there are 123 different languages spoken in Nepal. Most people live in rural areas even now, and main source of income is agriculture. You also know Nepal is where the Mount Everest is. Nepal is also the birthplace of Gautam Buddha. Just wanted to say that because it's a beautiful country. But it has some really terribly discriminatory gender norms. I just wanted to share some of those with you. So during this presentation, what I'm going to do is give you an overview of the country and cultural context, and then talk to you about the recent conflict and the impacts of conflict on women, mostly. So Nepal is a patriarchal society, as if UK is not. And the literacy rate is very low among women compared to men. In some areas, it's just 35%. And if you compare that between the younger generation and older generation, you can even find lower literacy rate among the elderly population. Urban areas are more literate than rural areas, and there are various gender discriminatory practices, even in present day Nepal. There is a practice called Thalpari practice, which is practiced in the western part of the country. You might have heard about it. You can call it monthly exile of women and girls. So when they have period, they are not allowed to stay in the house. They are supposed to be living somewhere in a small hut. And this is how it looks in some of the cases, and in some of the cases it is even worse than this. So every month or every week, so we get to hear about women and girls dying during the period because of snake bites, cold, and various illnesses. There is a movement going on at the moment in Nepal, and lots of people are raising awareness about it. But it is culturally so ingrained and being practiced for such a long time, it is really difficult. So one thing that the government recently did was they went and they were just removing all of these huts that were built in the village, but that was faced with a backlash from the community. And some of them were saying, if a woman, menstruating woman, enters the house, we are going to burn that house. So that kind of resistance. By saying this, I'm not saying the whole of Nepal is practicing Thalpari. It is mostly practiced in the western part of the country, but there is some form of practice in the whole of Nepal. So when women are having period, they are not supposed to touch men or not supposed to do puja, which is religious ceremonies, and not supposed to eat certain types of food and things like that. If you want to read more about it, you can also look at, you can just Google Thalpari system and you'll find lots of articles and videos about that. Dowry is another problem. Again, this comes in various forms. Somewhere money is given to the groom and groom's family. In some communities, it is in terms of goods, furniture, cars, motorbikes, and things like that. Child marriage, there is a lot of advocacy and education against child marriage, but then still, it is still being practiced. And so more than a third of girls are married before they turn 18, even now. Marriage is almost universal. Everybody is expected to get married after there is certain age, which has a lot of consequences on upbringing of girl child, because that has impact on education, because they are seen as somebody else's property, which means the less you invest, the better it is. And if you are practicing dowry system in your community, which means you will have to pay anyway to the groom's family, why to spend more on education? And that leads to other kinds of consequences. So as I said, I'm going to be talking about conflict, not about disaster, but also I thought it is important to mention that Nepal is also at high risk of various forms of natural hazards and related incidents. So floods, heat waves, cold waves, landslides are regular events every year. We hear lots of news about that. And also, it's also at high risk of earthquakes. And Nepal is also ranked as the fourth worst country in terms of climate vulnerability. Census data actually shows that almost everybody has experienced some form of the impacts of climate change in Nepal. These are some of the images of various types of natural hazards related disasters. You can see flooding, landslides, and these two images are of the recent earthquakes damaging really cultural heritage. So, I mean, most of you might already know about the 2015 earthquake, but then there have been lots of other earthquakes in the recent past. One of the earthquakes that Jessica mentioned also had impact. The Bihar earthquake had impact in Nepal as well. Almost nearly 9,000 people died then as well, 8,519. Almost all the houses in Kathmandu, which is the capital city, was destroyed. Likewise, in 88, earthquake, 1,000 people died, and then again in 2015, 9,000 people died at lost. 3.5 million people were displaced due to the earthquake. And that earthquake also triggered various landslides, so there is a number there, you can see how big the consequence was. So I'll just now take you through to some of the details about how the civil war started and what were the impacts. So Nepal was ruled by monarchy for 240 years. Democracy was established in 1990, but and people had lots of hopes from the newly elected democratic government. But actually, the leaders of the political parties basically did the same thing that was done during the monarchy, and people were frustrated because of their power. A struggle over the power and unstable political situations. In the meantime, Communist Party of Nepal actually announced an armed struggle, which they called People's War. One of the aims, or the main aim that they said was to eliminate all kinds of discriminations, including gender-based discriminations. Therefore, that attracted a lot of attention from people. Lots of women joined. There is no exact data as to how many women took part in the movement, but you can see 33 to 50% women's representation within the Maoist movement. The conflict lasted for 10 years and it ended in 2006 with a comprehensive peace agreement. As in any conflict, it impacted, even though the conflict started in the western, from the western part of the country. Slowly, it impacted the whole nation. Over 13,000 people were killed, hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, thousands of people were disappeared, and there were other consequences, social consequences on health and well-being, economic consequences. Schools were closed. People were psychologically traumatized because they saw their own people being killed in front of their eyes. And there were lots of cases of sexual violence against women by both parties. And some of the women and girls who were forced to leave their homes because of the fear from both conflicting parties ended up in the capital city, and they ultimately ended up in sex work for survival. So there were lots of indirect impact of conflict on women and girls, because I'm only talking about women and girls because that's the focus of my research, but obviously men were also impacted in various ways. It's been 14 years since the war ended, the formally People's War ended, but hundreds of thousands of people still are displaced. They have not been able to go back to their homes for various reasons. The lands that were captured during the war have not been returned. Those people who were fighting come from the same village, so there is insecurity that when they go back, something might happen. Some of the people are already settled in the Kathmandu, which is the capital city, and people who have entered this kind of basically become prostitutes due to the forced situations. Are not able to go back. Likewise, the victims of rape and single mothers are also not being able to go back to their homes. So they're still living. People who were their families of disappeared. People are still waiting to hear about the whereabouts of their loved ones. There hasn't been any progress made on that. People don't know what's the situation of their family members. Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there is another commission to deal with the disappearance, were established in 2010, 2015 in fact. They have collected 60,000 complaints from the people, but it is highly politicized, and nothing has been done so far. Political instability, we had, I'm saying we because I also am from Nepal, so that's why I tend to say we. So we had 25 governments in 27 years, so that tells you how, what the political situation was like. And that has added further complexity in dealing with conflict-related grievances and impacts. And on top of that, the 2015 earthquake added to that complexity. Further people died, many people displaced, and the government had to redirect all of the resources to support the conflict, to the earthquake victims. And likewise, the NGOs and humanitarian organizations had to focus on the earthquake victims than the conflict victims, even though the same people were victimized or suffered in earthquake as well. But the focus was now on supporting the victims of earthquakes rather than conflict victims. GDP was recorded at 0% in 2016. However, if you look at the gender rights, Nepal ranked actually 42, ranked higher than its per capita income. That tells something, and which suggests that political stability and economic growth are not necessarily the main factors for women's empowerment. So can women benefit from war then? So that's the question that I deal with, and I work a lot on that. I focus extensively on that. And I'm going to say briefly, just want to give you an overview because of the time constraint. And if you have any question, I'll be happy to take that afterwards. There are various transformations that have taken place during and in post-conflict Nepal. And one of the transformations is the transformation in the political landscape of Nepal. Women have had the right to vote since 1951. However, their participation in politics was limited until 2008, which was after the peace agreement, only up to 6%. And that was also out of the reach from majority of women. There were only the wives and widows and daughters of the politicians. However, during the conflict, women's empowerment became a main agenda, and that created a lot of awareness among people. And then the post-conflict discourse was very strong on social inclusion and proposed representation, which guaranteed the 33% quota for women in politics. As a result, when the first Constituent Assembly election took place, 33% women became the members of the CA. And recently, in 2017, local election took place after 27 years, which saw a huge number of women's participation. So the political landscape has changed dramatically. Really, it's a significant transformation in Nepal in terms of women's participation in politics. I won't go into the details. As I said earlier, I'll be happy to take questions afterwards. So now I would also like to talk about cultural transformation. There have been lots of cultural transformations in Nepal. Women's role were mostly confined to the households before. When I'm talking about women, I'm overgeneralizing. There are various types of women, but majority of women's role was very much confined to the house, and there was a clear distinction between the roles of men and women. But during conflict, that changed for various reasons. Conflict pushed people to do things that they would not have done if they were in a normal situation. And one of them was the practice of widowhood. So in Nepal, if you're a widow, if you become a widow, no matter at what age, and because of child marriage, you could be a widow at the age of 15, but you were supposed to maintain that throughout your life. And that also means that widow had to wear white sari. And that was practiced mostly in the upper caste, in the families. So these are the Bollywood actresses. If you're married, if you're not married, you can wear any other color. But if you're a widow, you were supposed to wear white color and not any other color. But and also Bidova is the direct translation of widow, and that means women without a husband. So that can tell you a lot about how widows are seen. So there are various explanations of why white sari was given to widows, but one of the things is it signifies purity. So widows had to be pure and loyal to the husband even after their death. So before the Civil War, there were lots of strict rules around widowhood. They're supposed to wear white sari, supposed to eat certain food, not supposed to eat certain food. Obviously, there were restrictions around their movement. But during conflict, lots of young women became widows. There is no exact data, as well, very weak. Nepal is very weak in collecting this kind of data. But then there were more widows than widowers. And most of them were young, under the age of 14. During that time, there was something called the Red Collar Movement started, where some of the NGOs came together and said, these young widows, it's not their fault, it's because of the war. They were allowed to wear any other color before they got married, and they had given this one, which is not fair. So they started something called Red Collar Movement, which was faced with a backlash from the society saying, oh, you are earning, you're bringing dollars and international foreign projects and ruining our culture. It was faced with a backlash, but later on, lots of NGOs who were supporting these widows took a different approach, and they started gathering these widows into small groups and started giving some education, and religious leaders were invited to give education and tell them that it is not actually something wrong if you wear any other color, but this is something given to you, which is culturally constructed, it is fine to wear any other color. So some women started defying that and wearing other color. And as in any other society, they were being challenged by people, but slowly many women started wearing it. And now nobody wears white sari, no white widow wears white sari. The president of Nepal is a woman and is a widow. If you look at her appearance on media before, she was wearing white sari, but now she comes in any other color. So things have changed now, and just because I don't have time, you can also see lots of changes in the security sector. Before, women were not allowed in combat role, during the Maoist conflict, Maoist women who had joined Maoist war proved that women can do what men can do, and the government started recruiting women to fight against Maoist women. And now, because of the social inclusion discourse, 20% of reservation has been made for women in the Nepal Army. Likewise, driving was accepted if you are driving your own car, but driving as a profession for women was not there. But this conflict, when people displaced, women needed to survive. When income wasn't enough, they started looking for alternative arrangements and started driving. Initially, again, faced with lots of criticism, but later on it became a norm. If you go to Nepal, this is like electric vehicle. Majority of the drivers are women, and they're well accepted. No questions asked. So as I said, and there have been lots of changes in legal provisions as well in Nepal. What I would like to end with is that I'm not saying the conflict is a positive thing. It should happen in order to bring about change. But what I'm saying is it could be a vehicle for empowerment, especially for women and marginalized groups, because it creates such environment where women are able to exercise their agency, which leads to transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So our final speaker, Dr. Akhtar Alam, who is a researcher at the UCL Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction, and also assistant professor on the University of Kashmir, exploring conservation science, exploring processes and the interplay of natural and social environment.
Hello. I understand that you have been bombarded by too much narratives and text and was speaking about. I'm sorry you had to hear me as well. Trying to let now. So please. I'll just talk about the challenges to the disaster reduction and capacity building in the Himalayas. So there may be some overlaps because with the previous presenters, because we are talking about the same region, but I'll be presenting a larger picture of the region than talking about the specific locality. So when we actually talk of this Himalayan region as a mountain region, this is the Himalayan mountain chain, which we call as Himalaya or Himalayas. But when we look as a whole to this picture, we call this Hindu Kush Himalaya. So there are some peculiarities of this region, which are basically related to this presentation. That's why I would like to mention those. One, that it is larger in size. It is almost 3,500 kilometers long. And what does that mean? That means it is spread over multiple countries, 8 countries that covers Afghanistan in the west and Myanmar in the east, and in the way it has Pakistan, India, China, Bhutan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. So another typical characteristic, or we sometimes refer this region as a roof of the world. That is because it has got the high mountains, and sometimes it is also referred to as the third pole because it has got more, snow and ice reserves than any region outside the polar areas. So these are some typical characteristics of this region. So looking at the title of my presentation, I'll be specifically talking about how these basically different aspects, they are different but actually interconnected. So how these aspects are actually creating the impediments in the way of disaster reduction and capacity building on the whole. So that's one actually frequency of natural hazards and disasters. And then we have the important attribute or important process, that's climate change, that is going to have some significant impact in the region. Poverty and population are the typical characteristics of the region and very much related to the capacity building, disaster reduction. Then environmental degradation as one of my colleagues mentioned in detail, and habitat loss. Territorial conflicts, very unique to the region, and almost every country in the region has some conflict with its neighbor, so far as the territorial conflict is concerned. And then how the institutional mechanism is actually operating in the region is also one aspect which is very important to discuss about the title of this presentation. Anyway, I have three observations which I believe regarding the frequency of hazards. One is that we have, as the speakers before we mentioned, that almost every hazard is present. We talk of earthquakes, we talk of floods, we talk of landslides. I mean, many other extreme climates, storms, wildfires, they are present there. And the frequency of these events is actually relatively very high in the region if we compare it to the very close neighboring region. Say, for example, if I compare northern part of the Himalaya with the southern Indian subcontinent, you will see there's a huge difference in the occurrence in the frequency of various hazards. And since the region is a lot of things are exposed, the resources, human resources, property is exposed, and at the same time, the people, the socioeconomic conditions of the people are actually deprived. So this makes a complete recipe for disasters. So most of the events which basically into the hazards take place, most of the events actually turn into disasters. So that's again, an issue in the region. I will just try to give you some basic idea about the region in the sense that, if you compare, basically this region is a plate boundary, is a convergent plate boundary where actually two plates meet. Indian plate is basically going down the Eurasian plate. And if you see this part is the Indian plate part, and this part is the Eurasian plate part. And if you see the frequency of the earthquakes from 1950, you will see huge number of earthquakes. These are epicenters, and all these events are magnitude 5+ events. And if you plot all the events, which are mostly actually the aftershocks, but you will find this density much more than what I have plotted. So I'm just trying to show you the frequency of the earthquakes is actually very high. And if you go into the historical past, you will see there have been tons of earthquakes which have basically resulted in huge human loss. These are plot ones are the historical events which have resulted in the huge loss and which have got the magnitude of sometimes equal or more than magnitude 8. So we have some two recent examples, like in 2005, which is in death of more than 87,000 lives in northwest Himalaya, and in 2015, which one of the speakers said about the Nepal earthquake, it again resulted in death of huge number of the people. So similarly, since I'm talking about the frequency of the events, this is one glimpse of the different and very recent actually. You will see this is the extreme precipitation event in 2014. Almost all of the South Asia got affected because of this precipitation. Whole of the South Asia was actually flooded. Then avalanches. This year's avalanche resulted in death of 77 people in northwest Himalaya. First flood in Ladakh in 2010, and 2014 floods resulted in death of 557 people. These are very recent events, and if you scan the history, if you scan the historical documents, you will see there have been too many events of this nature and character. And of course, landslide hazard is very common because it's a mountainous region, and you will see landslides are actually very widespread and common phenomenon in the mountainous region. And landslides take place mostly because they are being triggered by the extreme precipitation, but earthquake-triggered earthquakes also take place. There is an example of one which basically blocked one of the largest river channels in the northwest Himalaya. This was triggered by 2005 earthquake. And similarly, these landslide-related events are very common. Looking at the larger picture of the Himalaya in terms of the loss from the various events, frequency of the events and the impacts, you will see actually the floods are very dominant. Floods are very dominant with 40% in terms of events, followed by storms and then earthquakes, and rest cover the following of the hazards. In terms of the people killed by each different hazard, the Storms basically top the list with 46%, followed by earthquakes, and then some impact by flooding as well. But in terms of the impact, in terms of economic losses, floods are actually really dominating because they have the wider influence in the region than other two hazards. Anyway, there are two spikes which are very important or interesting to look at. One is Bangladesh, and number of events is actually very low and the deaths very high. And another spike is here, Myanmar, number of events low and the deaths very high. The point is, only two events, only two storms resulted in death of more than 100,000 lives. So in both the cases, so that is why there is they are proportionally very different. Now, there is one point which I want to make is that there are risks which are of different types, and there are different factors responsible. Not all can be covered, but two are very important with respect to the flooding, earthquakes, and storms. What is that? In general, the building codes are not being followed across specifically earthquakes, and most of the existing building stock in the region is actually not resistant to earthquakes. So we know that it is not actually earthquakes which kill the people, it is our own buildings, our own infrastructure which kills us. So when you have the buildings which have not been built as per the building code, that means they can be very dangerous. And that's actually the case in the Himalayan region in general. So, of course, as I told you that most of the existing building stock is not earthquake resistant, so it can trigger a huge disaster in case of a larger earthquake. And another important aspect with regard to these hazards, earthquakes, and storms, is this: actually, human settlements expand unabatedly into the high hazard areas. You talk of people moving floodplains built up and cities growing up in the floodplains because of a number of reasons, because of population growth and other things. And most important is that land cost, because land cost is something where you can have comparatively land at a lower price in the floodplain area and then the other area. So people would prefer. Another thing is that regulations, rules, and regulations are not being implemented, and many other things. Now, the big challenge in this, in light of these hazards, is that we need to basically convince people for retrofitting of existing structures and earthquake-safe future construction. That's a big challenge which region has to basically work on. So they need to go for retrofitting and go for the safer construction in future as well. Another important thing is that implementing land use regulations to curtail population growth in the high hazard areas. Too many things have to be done, but these things I think they are very important with respect to this region. In the past, there has been too much. I mean, the clustering of disaster has been so close in space and time that it didn't allow. This is a specific example in Kashmir Valley, that it didn't allow basically society to bounce back to the normal, because events after event basically hit them, and it resulted in really, even the secondary effects of the disasters actually turned into bigger disasters. Here is an example of 19th century Kashmir. You will see the events like flood, cholera, earthquake, famine, and drought. In one decade, these many events took place. And it was a society at that time when it was socioeconomically much more deprived than it is present. So it didn't allow society to come back of the adverse situation. And it was really, and the process actually was giving rise to a ratchet effect, where society wanted to come back to normal. But another event is coming and hitting the society and never allowing them to come to a normal position. So what this was leading to the process leading to manifold increase in the impacts affecting every sector, each aspect of their life, with disastrous secondary effect. This was actually more true with the 19th century Kashmir. Yeah, so another aspect which I would like to discuss is that climate. Of course, we know the scenario of the climate, what's right now at the global level, but almost same is true with our region as well. The temperatures are rising and precipitation is actually going down. So I'll be brief on this. We have the data of different stations. We show this trend. Temperatures rising, precipitation decreasing. So what it will have, we have, as I told you, that the region, Himalayan region, is actually also referred as third pole, meaning it has the huge ice and snow reserves. The most of the studies which we have, standard research which has come out, in most of the research suggests that the glaciers, whether it is, I mean, there have been many opinions that some glaciers behave differently, like they've discovered behave differently, and glaciers without they've discovered behave differently, or in different altitudes glaciers behave differently, or sometimes the size of glacier matters. But in all cases, the general scenario is that glaciers are actually depleting. What will it have? It will have impact on. There are some examples from the Kashmir Himalaya as well. In all the cases, the glacier area is actually depleting. And when we look at the snow cover, it doesn't show any significant trend. But the thickness of snow cover, snow is actually showing a decline. But its aerial expansion is not showing any special significant trend variation. So if our glaciers would be depleting, it would be having the immediate impact on the river discharge. So what will happen? As of now, river discharge is considered to be more or less stable in the Himalayan region, but it's going to be having a change in the coming future, because when the glacial source will deplete further, the rivers would definitely have the reduced discharge levels. But this is a scenario which shows this part, the contribution to the total percent from the glacial runoff. You will from the glacial belt actually you will see this area contributes more, because this is where maximum glaciers are, and we have the Siachen glacier here, and this is also the area which is also sometimes referred as the world's highest battlefield, because we have three big armies actually confronting here in this zone at the Siachen glacier. The armies of India, Pakistan, and China. But as this region is concerned, the contribution from the glacial belt is low compared to this. And when you talk of snow, this is more or less similar. But when you talk of the contribution from the rainfall, this side is dominant. This is because this side is actually influenced by a rain-bearing weather phenomenon called the monsoon. So in this area, maximum precipitation takes place in the form of rainfall. So this is the reason why there is a variability in terms of contribution to the total runoff by different, by snow, glacial ice, and rainfall. Anyway, so of course, these are some general implications that can have similar effects anywhere on the globe, but we may be having significantly more stronger than any other region, because, thank you very much. No. So we have if water availability would be affected, it will affect the water availability for different users of about 2 billion people. So you can assume. Similarly, biodiversity, which is dependent on the water and all that, agriculture, economy, land use, geostrategic issues is very important, because we have some regional treaties between different countries. If discharge, another typical character of the region is that poverty and population. I think I may not be able to complete all the slides, but I will just try to help you give a quick glimpse of. There's a variation in terms of the resource and population. There's a significant gap, and population is actually high, and the density is very high, and the gap between the poor and richer is actually widening further. The rich is getting richer, and poor is getting more poor with every passing day. And when you talk about the poverty scenario, you will see the Hindu Kush Himalayan region is in Hindu Kush Himalayan region. 25 to 50% people are actually living in the multidimensional poverty, which multidimensional poverty covers health, education, and there are some indicators which show that. Anyway, so population size on these two countries, if you talk about the Hindu Kush Himalaya, on these two countries, China and India basically account for 35% of the population. So a big thing to worry about. And environmental degradation has been really a big concern, because we have the 4 out of 34 global biodiversity hotspots in the region. What does that mean? That means they are rich so far as the biodiversity is concerned, but at the same time, they are facing tremendous pressure. And 75% of the ocean Himalayan, there are some examples of land use change. Territorial conflict, many things in regard to Himalaya are you have territorial conflicts, and that results in too many problems, right? Sometimes global aid after disaster is also affected. And this is the final slide, I'm just concluding. this is very important because institutional mechanism for the RR is actually still evolving. It is not functional completely. It is mostly response centric. It does not prepare. It is actually last in priority. Investments are being made in the RR, and of course for implementation and in general there is no involvement of the committee. Actually, the board approach is top bottom, not bottom up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And maybe the speakers can come up and join us on the panel here. Right, so sorry, we've slightly overrun. I propose that we'll actually just move, we'll finish the session at sort of 10 past the hour. I mean, if you have to leave now, we can just split out the back. I won't go into a long introduction, because we can just move on with questions. But first of all, do we have some questions from the audience? What I'll do, I'll try and gather up a few questions. We've got the Landy and then Matthew will pass on there. So a few questions and then come back to the panel. So do put your hands up and have a question. Wait for the microphone. And do keep your hands up if you're asking questions so we can get the microphones to you.
Did women being sort of having a larger influence in the actual government change policy, or was the direction of the government similar? So did sort of having more involvement, did it impact the actual direction of the government change?
So we'll just wait for any more questions and we'll gather them up and then bring them back to them. Oh, okay, so could you just repeat the question?
Can you please repeat the question? What was that?
So with women being more involved in politics, did the direction of the government's policy change?
Any other questions?
What do you believe the future for Ladakh will be?
What will the future of Ladakh will be, and just down in front here?
There has been a recent research about the new bacteria coming up from the depletion of glaciers in the Himalaya region. So just wondering if anybody has any expertise on like maybe the future plagues or that or like disease as a sort of disaster.
I can talk about the depletion of the Himalayas, but to be frank enough, I don't know what is the interconnection between the different diseases, and I have not studied that, so I'm not much aware of that. Yeah.
So the simple answer would be yes, because there is a large number of women in politics. 33% is quite a large number, and likewise 41% in the local government. But then to what extent have they been able to change the policy that are women-friendly or gender-friendly? Still a question. Good thing about Nepal is that the political quota, the quota system is not only for women in politics, but also in other sectors. So women have come together from various sectors to fight against the rights for women, and therefore you can see lots of legislative changes in Nepal at the moment.
Yeah, regarding the glacier, so far as the connection between the disease and the glaciers is concerned, as Alam has already made a submission that we don't have any knowledge about this, whether there is a direct connection between the spread of the disease and the glacial depletion. But probably I could make one comment regarding this, that which is relevant to our area, because we have a large number of glaciers there. Of late, the tourism activity has been taken to these glacial areas also. We have one of the glaciers which is located in the world famous destination that is called the Pahalgam tourist destination, where the people are visiting in large numbers, in millions. I have quoted the figure already, it is 1.5 million people. And they are basically now traveling to the glacial snout, that is the base of the glacier. Maybe mixing up the people there from different ethnic groups, it could have an impact on the spread of the disease profile, which may be influencing the native region. That is probably what I could guess in the connection between the visiting of the glacier by so many people from different ethnic groups. That could be one of the probable causes so far as the spread of the disease is concerned. So this is my comment or the observation regarding your query.
Jessica, would you like to comment on any other questions?
Yes, thank you for the question on the future of Ladakh. It's a very difficult one, and one that Ladakhis are asking themselves at the moment in light of their political reorganisation of their status as a union territory. Disaster governance or disaster management is actually a secondary concern at the moment as they're trying to work out how everything else might work now that they no longer have to go to the state government, which was based in Srinagar previously. Now they're controlled by the central government. So they may well, I mean, it's a further centralisation of resources. Will they have easier access to money and to support? That's a big question mark, and they're undergoing consultations at the moment. There's a hugely strong local civil society there engaged in big development questions, which obviously relate to disaster governance. So one of the big, I mean, linking to some of the other presentations, one of the big environmental concerns at the moment is it's an incredibly kind of sensitive climatic area. So melting glaciers is a big issue, and they're coming up with lots of innovative ways to stem the melting of those glaciers or the speed of that melting. So the ice stupa is one, which is an artificial glacier that's meant to decrease melting levels. But of course, as I mentioned in my presentation, with Delhi controlling Ladakh now, will there be an increase in the ability of civil society to function, civil society space, or is this actually an entrenchment of their power in an area that for them is very kind of strategically important in relation to China and Pakistan? That's a big question mark and something that's going to be an ongoing discussion from here forward.
Okay, thank you. I mean, so I think with the Himalayas, we obviously there's these big geopolitical players here, as well as the drive of climate change, which makes it really quite a very complicated social and physical environment. We have some more questions from there.
Thank you very much. I've really become very impressive with your reports. Quick question. What do these pressures mean for the social cohesion across the Himalayan regions in terms of the relationship between different ethnic, linguistic, or religious groups? So A, impact on social relations. B, if you have time, is the migration. Where do people go when they suffer from displacement and disaster?
Question?
Is there any policy from the government or the movement from the grassroots organization or NGO to reduce the land use in Himalaya and Kashmir, like the deforestation or Himalayan? Is there any measure to reduce it? Thank you.
And final question.
You mentioned that the response to disasters was mainly reactive as opposed to proactive. If the region was to become more proactive, what sort of infrastructure policy would you like to see implemented across the region would be most effective?
Okay, thank you. So I think we'll probably just take it from the right again. So I think do choose the question if you want to answer.
Yeah, of course. One is there any policy with regard to the land climate change? Of course, there are some policies in place which talk about how land is being managed at different places in different cities or localities. But what it is lacking is implementation, and there are too many reasons why the implementation is lacking. One, the enforcement agencies are not efficient. There is some sort of corruption as well. And another reason is that government does not have any alternatives. That if they propose something, then what can be the alternative for that policy? There are no alternatives available. So this is, I think, one, that policies are existing, but there is a poor implementation. And poor implementation has too many reasons why that's not being implemented. That's my take on the language policy, the region, and its implementation.
So I'll answer the question regarding migration. So if I talk about Nepalese context, migration has always been part of Nepalese society. People used to migrate for economic reasons, but since the conflict, the migration escalated. And so people who have money, they go to UK, Australia, USA to study. They send their children to study abroad, but those who do not have money, they go to the Middle Eastern countries, Middle East, basically, to as a laborer. And in recent years, women's migration to the Middle East has significantly increased, and the government has come up with policies that are more compatible to the migration pattern, and that has consequences on women as well. For instance, women are not supposed to go legally; they are not meant to, but they are choosing different routes because migration has become so much integral part of the society. They are going anyway, and women are being vulnerable to various forms of exploitations because of that. In terms of DRR policy being reactive than proactive, and it is also true in Nepalese context. There are various things that may lead to such reactive approach. One of the things is the imagination about DRR itself, the vision about DRR, what DRR means. It often means DRR related to one particular event. The structural causes of disasters are not considered in the vision, and that leads to the design and interventions. And also there are some operational level challenges in different contexts. For instance, in the context of Nepal, the disaster-related funds are not released until the event happens. So even if you would like to spend something on preparedness, there is no such mechanism which will allow you to spend the money. So there are some operational level challenges, some institutional level challenges, and most importantly, the vision itself needs rethinking, which is now very much reactive and proactive.
I will be just taking this discussion of migration further deeper. So far as the Indian Himalayas are concerned, we don't have the environmentally stressed migration pattern. As compared to this, if we are going to the mainland Indian subcontinent, we have the situation of drought, which induces the migration of millions of people during the period of drought. And a significant proportion of the population also migrates permanently from that place to other places. But we have a unique example of migration in the Jammu and Kashmir region. That is called the trans-women's migration. J&K region is comprising of two diverse regions so far as the climatic scenario is concerned. Jammu is experiencing subtropical climate. Kashmir is experiencing temperate climate. In fact, this I have included in my presentation because of the paucity of the time. I could not discuss this slide. So what the people are doing, especially the indigenous communities, when they are feeling the brunt of the heat during the summers in the Jammu region, they migrate towards the temperate region of Kashmir along with men and material, including the livestock. It is in huge numbers. This indigenous population constitutes almost 6% of the total population of Jammu and Kashmir. And this is rather a very rare phenomenon that along with the families, children, livestock, they are migrating bodily from the Jammu region escaping the subtropical heat towards the temperate latitudes of Kashmir Valley, which have got relatively very mild and moderate summers. And then, when the winter is approaching in the Kashmir Valley, very harsh winter, these people are again making the reverse migration towards the subtropical region of Jammu. So this is a very unique phenomenon in terms of the migration, called the phenomenon of the transhumance, along with families, children, including their livestock. But this is a permanent feature, and these people do reside in these areas in Kashmir Valley for 4 to 5 months, and then Jammu region for 4 to 5 months. It's a very unique migration pattern so far as that part of the region is concerned.
Thank you for your question. So how to stop disaster responses being so reactive and being more proactive? Well, the fundamental change that's needed is reducing vulnerability, political and socioeconomic vulnerability. One of the great kind of cliches around disasters is that they are a great leveler, a great socioeconomic leveler, and that everyone is equally impacted if an earthquake or a hurricane hits a particular area. And while that may be true in the minutes of the crisis, actually so much of the recovery depends on political capital, poverty levels, inequality, and so on. So assessing and understanding what vulnerability exists in a particular context, and then addressing it. And what that involves is a variety of different things. It can be structural, so preventing the deforestation that Sultan and Akhtar are talking about in their presentation, enforcing building codes to make buildings and structures earthquake resilient. I think obviously initiatives that reduce poverty, address inequality, tackle disaster risk reduction at all education levels, so engaging children in risk reduction practices too. And what I think is important for all of our areas that we talked about in the Himalayan region is diversifying the economy to prevent an over-reliance on a particular area that might be badly affected by a disaster. So I know in Ladakh they're incredibly dependent on a tourism economy, which is not only significantly impacted during a crisis context, but also the rapid expansion of tourism within particularly the urban areas in Ladakh is increasing socioeconomic vulnerability among the population more widely. So the number of guest houses is contaminated water sources, there's a rapid expansion of unsafe buildings. You're getting kind of bottlenecks of traffic and increasing density of populations, and all of these are kind of increasing hazard risks and vulnerability among the population.
Thank you. I think I saw some hands over this side. Do you want to run around questions? Starting with that side to begin with. So there's a question. Somebody at the back there. Back row. Okay, person there. And maybe the third question you just at the back. Yeah, okay. So please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I really enjoyed this session. I just returned from fieldwork in the Darjeeling Himalayas looking at landslides. And I found that actually landslides there, most people there the residents there would not describe them as natural hazards. They see them more as the outcomes of unplanned development and construction, particularly road construction, which I know is a huge issue in Nepal as well. The rate at which roads have been constructed is prolific. I think I saw a statistic that was the most JCBs sold in the country, Nepal, and any of the country in South Asia. So building on that, could moving beyond considering landslides as natural hazards and more considering them as outcomes of unplanned development help shift the DRR agenda from reactive to proactive in terms of planning policy?
Thank you. Then I think somebody's got the microphone there, then you can just put the microphone over to the back there. So if you've got a microphone, please ask your question.
So I have a question. I was wondering how far-reaching the equalization of job opportunities for women in Nepal has become. And particularly, I'd like to refer to the climbing and mountain leading industry that is quite a crucial area of tourism within Nepal, especially for myself, as I'm going to be visiting in November. I'd be really interested, as I'm choosing to go with a female guiding company. I'd like to know how common and well-known that is within the board.
I was just going to ask a similar question to that about, is there a way for the population to actually use natural disasters and the natural landscape to their advantage? So can they utilize geothermal energy stores or anything like that to accelerate development?
So I think we'll also go from right left again.
Yeah, so the first regarding landslides, we understand right now in the Himalayas, of course, it's in the mountainous region, and naturally landslides is a very big problem. But a few things have actually accelerated the process because of the new road construction, especially along the roads. The slopes are being made unstable, and that basically results in more landslides. And if you see the pattern, landslides are actually taking place mostly along the roads or along the river channels, and in the areas where the slopes have been made unstable. As you said, that there have been a number of excavators in the park, in the further, but it has some actually sort of commercial aspect as well, because there are a lot of development is going on in the mountainous regions now, and now people find it as an opportunity to use different things like technology to go for new developments. But there is least consideration of the hazards they actually create and they trigger. So there is a need of the policy intervention, but actually from the government and the planners where something can be done. For example, if a project is being implemented in any mountainous region, especially in the Himalayas, so it is normally a government project. So it is very difficult to basically create hurdles or stop that project that would go on. So making common people aware about the various risks associated with these things, we can do that, but again there is an economic aspect. Even the people who are involved with the activity may not like that. It may be a process of general interest for somebody who is not really involved in the activity itself, but for the person who is actually directly involved in the activity, for him it is a commercial activity, so he doesn't have any other aspect or any other alternative for that. Of course, environmental management can be used as an opportunity as well for actually lowering the risks in many cases. But again, it needs some policy intervention at larger scale. So, and community awareness, of course, involving community to make them realize about the importance of the various geo-environmental things which are surrounding them and how they can utilize it in a proper way and make their zone risk-free. But there is a lot of intervention is needed from the planners at the moment.
Development and disaster is a very complex nexus, and in Nepal, development often means building roads, and it has gone crazy at the moment with the local government, and so the local government and local leaders have certain amount of money for the so-called development, and most of the money is being spent on developing and constructing roads at various scales. There's a lack of awareness and a certain level of corruption, and so it's mostly to do with institutional. I don't know. I mean, really, government has to rethink what development means, and it has really it has to trickle down to the local level as well. And lots of sensitizations has to happen. That is one of the reasons, I guess. And this does not just have impact on disaster, but also various other kinds of impacts, such as health and other things. And also, development activities are very much closely linked to the recent conflict in Nepal as well. You might have read about it. In terms of tourism, women's participation in the tourism industry in Nepal is kind of open, very open. Lots of space. Women are in various jobs now, so there are less restrictions on women than before. I have a very little knowledge of the tourism industry, but as far as I know, tourism is still a very much male-dominated area at the moment, and women's participation is still very low.
There has been some query regarding the population and the resources. Actually, if we are going to evaluate the scenario of Himalayas in the context of the population and the resources, it's not quite imbalancing in the sense that Himalayan region constitutes 6% of the total population of the whole India. But in terms of geographical area, it is 18% area. What is basically the problem which has given emergence to the excessive pressure on the environmental resources of the Himalaya is that it's not the paucity of the resources, but it is basically the low level and obsolete technology which is being used for carrying out the different economic activities in the entire Himalayan belt. Not losing the sight of this fact that it is the agriculture sector which constitutes the backbone of Indian Himalayan states. The level of productivity of agriculture sector is extremely low, at times characterized by negative returns. And second important aspect that if some meaningful technological interventions are going to be introduced in the agriculture and its allied activities, especially the dairy sector, the level of productivity of the sector could be taken at higher levels, which could boost the income levels of the people in the region. And it could release a lot of stress on the environmental resources of the very particular region. So it is not the imbalance in terms of the population and the resources, but the real problem is that we have the low level of technology in that belt for carrying out the different agricultural practices, or the practices which are being carried out in allied sectors, their level of productivity is very low. So with the passage of time, in some regions, very useful and important technological interventions have been made, and it is proving wonders. The levels of income, they have been multiplied by several times, and we are seeing the results there. They are very encouraging results. So this is one way how we are going to just release the pressure from the environmental resources so far as the population is concerned. The very immediate solution is we are going to boost the technological level so far as the different economic operations are concerned, especially focusing the agriculture and the dairy sector. That is very important.
So your question, should we consider avalanches not as natural hazards, but as development issues in order to move forward the DRR agenda? 100% definitely agree with you. Is it likely to happen? Not anytime soon. I think this is where you see economic agendas clashing with risk reduction and development priorities, and this isn't just a problem in this particular region, but actually with development and risk reduction as a whole, and the sustainable development goals framework too. As long as these frameworks like the SDGs and other development projects and even governments not even directly involved in risk reduction and disasters, as long as they don't question that constant and fundamental push for economic growth at all costs, then yes, we might see progress in certain examples of individual projects, but will we see any broader societal transformation? No, I don't think so. Those roads will keep getting built, the tourism industry will keep growing.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, it's 10 past now, so I think we should wrap up. I'll just say that the speakers will be available in the reception if you have further questions, and just want to thank the speakers and all the audience for